AP 120, Chapter 15, Topics, Alimentary Canal, Basics, and Oral Cavity. So digestion. Digestion is both a mechanical process, breaking things down physically, so from a big piece of fruit, say, down to little bitty tiny chunks, and breaking it down chemically. That's taking big molecules like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and breaking them down to smaller chemicals, to nutrients like glucose, amino acid, and fatty acids. And this is important because then we're able to absorb those nutrients. So the alimentary canal is another term for the passageway leading from the mouth to the anus. It is approximately 30 feet long. Starts with the mouth, the oral cavity, then leads to the pharynx, the back of the throat. And which two parts of the pharynx are included in the alimentary canal? Hopefully you said oropharynx and laryngopharynx. We do not want things to go up into the nasopharynx because then it could enter the nasal cavity. So from the oral cavity to the oropharynx and then laryngopharynx. From there, the food goes through the esophagus directly after the pharynx, then the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine, and then finally the rectum and anus. And from the esophagus to the anus, it is just a long muscular tube moving the food along its length. So when you look at that muscular tube of the alimentary canal, it turns out it has 4 layers. So looking at the cross section of the wall, there are 4 layers. The innermost layer is the mucosa. The mucosa layer includes the epithelium lining the inside surface of the alimentary canal, and then the connective tissues that the epithelial lining is attached to, which have some glands embedded in them. And the mucosa's job, of course, is protection, protect the tissues that are deeper. Also engages in some secretion and absorption, especially secreting mucus to help keep things moving along. And in certain areas along the alimentary canal, it is modified to form folds that will project into the space, into the lumen inside of the alimentary canal. The next layer out is the submucosa. The submucosa is primarily connective tissue. And it's also housing lots of blood vessels and lymph vessels and nerves, and provides, of course, the nourishments, the nutrients for the mucosa. Then out from that is the muscular layer, or muscularis. The muscular layer has 2 smooth muscle layers. It has the inner circular layer and the outer longitudinal layer. And the job of the muscular layer is to propel the food along the canal. And then the outermost layer is the serosa. Serosa, in many places, is part of the visceral peritoneum, so part of the peritoneum. And the serosa is lubricated because the serous fluid from the peritoneum provides lubrication, reduces friction, allows the alimentary canal to move as it moves things along internally and not get damaged by friction. And the serosa also structurally defines the organ. All right, here's a cross section of the wall of the small intestine. The wall of the small intestine again has the mucosa. Here's the open space or lumen. Here's the mucosa with, in this case, specialized projections that push up into the space, the lumen inside the small intestine. Then you have the submucosa with all those glands and blood vessels associated with it, the muscular layer, and the serosa. So, big job is moving materials along. One kind of movement is actually more of a mixing. Here, the muscles in the alimentary canal will contract in certain areas, back and forth, moving the digesting material back and forth, mixing it. And this process is called segmentation. Then there is peristalsis. Peristalsis propels the food material down the length of the alimentary canal. So you have the circular muscle tissue contracting behind the food, while the longitudinal muscle tissue contracts in front of it, helping to move the food along. Peristalsis. Peritoneum. Mentioned it already. Peritoneum is the largest of the serous membranes. It is found in the abdominal cavity. It has important functions. It has two layers, a visceral layer that lies on the organs, a parietal layer on the outside, and in between is a thin little space where you find the serous fluid. The serous fluid reduces friction. The components of the alimentary canal are always in motion, always moving around, so this prevents them from experiencing friction and becoming damaged. The peritoneum also, in some areas, has a lot of adipose tissue. That adipose tissue can help to protect the alimentary canal and other organs in the abdominal cavity. And then the peritoneum also attaches organs to the abdominal walls and to each other. So peritoneum is very important in the abdominal cavity. Here is the mouth with the oral cavity. The oral cavity is the entrance for the alimentary canal. So food and drink enters the mouth, enters the oral cavity. The oral cavity is the space between the tongue and the roof, which of course means the oral cavity size can vary depending on if you have your mouth wide open or shut tightly closed. So which of these is not a function of the mouth? And the answer is absorption of nutrients. You do not absorb nutrients in the oral cavity. There is mechanical digestion, chewing up, masticating, chewing up the food. There is some chemical digestion, breakdown of carbohydrates, and again, it is an entryway for food and drink. So the oral cavity, again, is between the hard palate and the tongue. We look at the mouth area in general. We have, of course, the cheeks on the lateral sides, forming the lateral walls and aiding in facial expression. We have the lips. Lips are very important, highly mobile structures, very sensitive. So when you bring food up to your mouth, the lips can tell if it's really hot or really cold, or if the texture of that food item is off. There's, of course, the tongue, the very thick muscular organ, covered with a mucous membrane and also lots of bumps called papillae. Tongue is attached to the floor of the oral cavity via the lingual frenulum. And the papillae, some of them are there for friction to help move the food around in the mouth, and some are for taste or gustations. Some of them are taste buds. The palate or roof of the oral cavity is called the hard palate toward the opening of the mouth. So the more anterior portion is the hard palate because it has bone in it. And then posterior to that is the fleshy soft palate that is mostly muscle connective tissue. And then, of course, at the very end of the soft palate, dangling in the back of the oral cavity, is the uvula. The soft palate and the uvula are important because when we swallow, they will push up and block the nasopharynx so that food will not go up into the nasal cavity. We do not want food and drink to go into the nasal cavity when we swallow. So again, soft palate and uvula will block the nasal cavity off. There are tonsils associated with the oral cavity and the pharynx. We have two palatine tonsils in the back of the oral cavity on either side. We have two lingual tonsils at the base of the tongue. And then there's also the pharyngeal tonsil that's up in the nasopharynx. So 5 tonsils found in the general area of the pharynx and oral cavity. Teeth. Obviously, we have teeth. We have 2 sets of teeth. Initially, the 20 primary teeth or baby teeth, and then they will slowly get replaced over time by the secondary teeth, the 32 secondary teeth. And in the skull here, you can see a secondary tooth forming and pushing out the primary tooth. So, the mouth is very important for chewing. The teeth are the critical structures for chewing, for mechanical digestion, breaking the food up into smaller physical pieces. We have 8 incisors that are involved in chopping. So, the 4 top and bottom teeth in the front are the incisors. We have 4 canines, 1 on each side, top and bottom of the incisors. Their canines are good for tearing into food. We have 8 premolars, 2 on each side of the canine. The premolars, important for grinding food, and then 12 molars, 3 on each side at the back of the mouth, and the molars are also important for grinding up food. So 8 incisors, 4 canines, 8 premolars, and 12 molars. Although a lot of people have the wisdom teeth removed, which means they have 1, 2, 3, 4 of the molars removed. So a lot of people only have 8 molars. All right, the tooth. The top portion of the tooth above the gum line is the crown. And the bottom portion of the tooth embedded in the socket is the root. So crown and root, above the gum line, below the gum line. Teeth are not bones. Structurally, they are very distinct from bones. You can also look at the tooth in terms of layers of tissue. The most superficial layer is the enamel. Enamel is what makes the teeth kind of white and extremely hard, the hardest substance our body can produce. Deep to that is the dentin. The dentin tissue makes the bulk of the volume of the tooth. And then deep to that, in the center core, is the pulp. And the pulp is the living tissue, possesses blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, etc. And the pulp, of course, is found in the pulp cavity and root canal of the tooth. So when you have a toothache, it is pain that is being signaled by nerves in the pulp. Finally, the tooth is held in the socket by this tissue referred to as the periodontal ligament. Holds the tooth in the socket. There are 6 salivary glands, 3 on each side, and they produce saliva. Saliva is important. It helps to moisten and dissolve food particles. The chemicals that get dissolved can then allow for tasting by the taste buds. Helps to keep the mouth cleansed and moist. And it also begins carbohydrate digestion. So there is enzymes in the saliva that start to break down carbohydrates. So chemical digestion does indeed occur in the oral cavity. So saliva is primarily water. It's like 99, 98, something like that. Hugely, mostly water, but it does have some electrolytes and the enzyme salivary amylase. Salivary amylase, this enzyme helps to break down carbs. Also found in saliva is some mucus. So besides the mucus being produced in the mucous membrane lining the oral cavity and on the tongue, we also get some mucus in the saliva. And the parasympathetic stimulation is what can lead to salivation. So parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system stimulates salivation by the sight of food, the smell of food, and even just thinking about yum, yummy, yum food. All right, we have 2 parotid glands. 2 parotid glands, they're close to the ear, and they secrete saliva onto the lateral walls of the mouth. We have 2 submandibular glands near the mandible. They squirt saliva up under the tongue. And then we have 2 sublingual glands underneath the tongue that produce saliva that sort of pulls underneath the tongue. And that is it for this part of chapter 15.